All right. Hello, everybody. We will be beginning. First of all, please note that the session is being recorded. We will stop recording at the question period, but before then, we will be recording the session. So, hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on addressing the surge in social polarization and hateful rhetoric online. In recent years, we've seen a troubling rise in divisive speech across social media platforms, often spilling into real-world harm. And with certain big tech companies rolling back, first of all, fact-checking and then safeguards against hate speech, the need for effective policies and on-the-ground prevention strategies has never been more pressing. So today we'll explore the broad consequences of online hate and also share insights on how we can protect our social fabric through evidence-based approaches. So thanks a lot for joining us, and let's get us started on this conversation. So first of all, I am going to quickly present our panelists. So first of all, we have Dr. Pablo Madriaza, who is a professor at the Université du Québec à Trois-Rivières. He holds a degree in psychology, a master's degree in anthropology, and a PhD in sociology. He has participated in numerous research projects and publications on violence and social conflict, including school violence, criminality, and social movements. He has recently conducted several studies on the prevention of violent extremism. He has worked for several years as the general coordinator of CPN-PREV, as well as for the UNESCO PREV chair. And then we will have Dr. Ghayda Hassan, who is a clinical psychologist and professor of psychology at UQAM. And she has co-chaired the Independent Advisory Committee for Gift City. She's the director of CPN-PREV and a co-chair of UNESCO PREV. She is a researcher and senior clinical consultant at Sherpa RAPS, and her systematic reviews, research, and clinical activities are centered around numerous topics: social suffering, intercommunity relations, radicalization and extremist violence, intervention in family violence and cultural diversity, identity, belonging, and mental health of children and adolescents from ethnic and religious minorities, and lastly, working with vulnerable immigrants and refugees. And finally, we will have Dr. Irin Saltman, who is the Membership and Programs Director at Gift City. She has worked in the technology, NGO, and academic sectors, building out international counterterrorism strategies and programs. Her research has focused on the nature of violent extremism online, youth radicalization, and the evaluation of counter-speech approaches. She was formerly Meta's head of counterterrorism and dangerous organizations policy across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. She also has practitioner experience, having worked for ISD Global. So Pablo and Ghayda will have around 40 minutes for their presentation on the systematic review, that is the bare bones of this conference. And then Dr. Irin Saltman will have up to 30 minutes, and we will have 15 to 20 minutes for questions at the end. So without further ado, I'll leave the floor to my colleagues.
So thank you very much, Sébastien. I will share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen? Yes? Okay,
yes.
No problem. So the first part of this presentation is for you, Ghayda, and then I can continue. Go ahead.
Right, no trouble. Yeah, we'll go back and forth. So yes, as Sébastien said, thank you very much for being here. And Erin, thank you so much for being here. I know it will be a very, very fruitful conversation that we will have together. So Pablo and I will be presenting the results of a systematic review that we conducted, funded by the Campbell Collaboration and the Community Resilience Fund at Public Safety Canada on the impact of exposure to hate on the internet and in traditional media. So I think, Pablo, we will explain a little bit more, but not too much in details about what systematic reviews are. And we can move to the next slide, Pablo, please, if you can. But systematic reviews are really a very, very robust methodology to basically tell us what research results we can trust. But very quickly prior to that, for those who don't know us, we are the Canadian Practitioners Network for the Prevention of Extremist Violence. We were founded in 2017 to really leverage capacities across the country and develop excellence in preventing violent extremism. We try to connect the practitioner sector with the research sector, with the policy sector to ensure a coherent response across the country and really to break the silos between those different fields, and particularly among researchers, practitioners, policymakers, and of course, communities that are impacted by these phenomena. Next slide. And so what we do, well, systematic reviews, we generate evidence, we generate consensus-based guidelines that follow a very robust Delphi strategies. We identify what are the existing initiatives across the country and how to build that capacity, how to develop communities of practice, and again, how to learn from each other as practitioners. And really, we try to disseminate those capacities and those resources. We do it through collaboration spaces, through co-construction spaces, through partnership spaces where everybody has something very precious to bring to the table. So it's really based on knowledge sharing with principles of integrity, dignity, and reciprocity, and also continuous learning and self-reflexivity, because this is an ever-changing phenomenon and we are all constantly confronted to those difficult things, both. So just to think about hate online, for example, and in traditional media, both on the professional level, but also on the personal level in our own lives. Next slide. You can take it from there, Pablo, if you want.
Okay, no problem. But problem, have you noticed that content on social media is becoming increasingly aggressive and polarized? And every day I see internet or I navigating for internet, I read a lot of comment, the hateful comment. And actually, I think this is exactly why we are here today. The goal of this presentation is to take a closer look at the consequences of content exposure to hate speech, both on social, as mentioned by Ghayda, and in traditional media, especially when we are not the direct target of these messages. This is important. In this study, we didn't focus on the victims of hate speech, but on anyone exposed to this hateful content, including everyone attending this conference. We will explore how this exposure can subtly influence our perceptions, attitudes, emotions, and behaviors toward affected groups. Together, we will reflect on the potential impact this might have on our mental well-being and the cohesion of our society. Ultimately, our purpose is to understand and become aware of this effect so that we can act in a more informed and responsible way, contributing to a more respectful and inclusive space for everyone. So, what is hate speech? Hate speech is any type of communication in speech, writing, behavior, or multimedia that attacks or uses a pejorative or discriminatory language with reference to a person or a group based on their protected characteristic. In other words, their religion, race, ethnicity, nationality, color, descent, and gender. This means that hate speech doesn't just target individuals, this is important, but rather the entire group they belong to, even when it appears to be directed at a single person. We know that this type of speech is increasing, and young people are the most exposed. To give you an idea of the scale of the problem, surveys conducted among people aged 15 to 30 found that up to 53% of Americans, 48% of Finns, and 39% of Britons reported being exposed to hateful content online. These numbers are truly alarming. of course. In the case of Canada, a recent survey shows that 72% of Canadians believe they are increasingly exposed to harmful online content, such as hate speech and harassment. 4 in 10 encounter hate speech regularly, with 16% exposed weekly and 5% exposed daily. Marginalized communities are particularly affected, with racialized individuals, people with disabilities, and LGBTQ plus individuals experiencing twice the rate of exposure and targeting. This number highlights the widespread impact of online hate in Canada. Faced with a glaring lack of information about the consequences of exposure to hate speech, we decided to gather and analyze all existing studies on the subject, a process known as a systematic review. In this extensive research, we aim to understand two main things: how hate speech affects us directly, and how it's linked to our attitudes, emotions, and behaviors. To address the first question, we examine studies where people were placed in experimental situations to observe their reactions. However, because real life is much more complex, we also consider studies that observe people in their daily life, for example, on social media. These studies cannot directly prove that hate speech causes certain reactions, but they show how the two phenomena are related. This is the case for correlational studies. Okay. Finally, we analyze online comments to see how one hateful message can lead to another, and even influence offline reality, such as an increase in hate crimes. Additionally, we specifically looked for studies on social media, traditional media, and political propaganda to gain a comprehensive view of how hate speech spreads and impacts our society. By doing all of this, our goals, of course, was to provide a clear and complete picture of the impact of hate speech in order to better understand it and hopefully find solutions. Now, let's dive into the general results of our study. After analyzing approximately 16,000 studies, a lot, from various sources, we selected 55 studies that perfectly met our criteria. It's important to note that most of these research is very recent, with the majority published after 2015. This highlights, of course, the relevance and timeliness of this topic in our society. By examining these studies, a clear trend emerged. A significant majority, 37 studies, focus on hate speech on online or social media. Only 8 studies examine exposure to hate speech in traditional media. Regarding the groups of people exposed to hate speech, most studies focus on non-specific groups or individuals belonging to the majority social groups. By examining the results of our systematic review, we identify 43 different types of outcomes or associations related to exposure to hate speech. These impacts or consequences can be very different, reflecting the complexity of the impacts of hate speech on individuals and society. We also conducted 24 meta-analyses with this information. This analysis allows us to recalculate all the results from studies that measure similar things. It's like putting all the studies that measure the same impact into a mixer and obtaining a global result that shows the overall trend. We will present you the finding actually of this meta-analysis. We have also organized these findings in 5 main categories: attitude changes, interpersonal behaviors, intergroups dynamics, psychological effects, and political beliefs. Each of these categories encompasses a variety of specific outcomes, as you can see on the screen. In the following slide, we will present and explore each of them in more detail. However, before showing you the specific finding, I will explain how to interpret them. If there is a red bar, this means that exposure to hate content significantly increased that variable. For example, higher level of depression. If there is a blue bar, this means that exposure to hate content significantly decreased that variable, like lower life satisfaction. Finally, if there is a gray bar, this means that there is not enough evidence to confirm a clear effect, so the relationship may not be significant. So let's explore further how exposure to hate in the media can shape our attitudes, beliefs, or opinions, particularly in relation to specific content or groups. When we talk about attitude changes, we refer to variation in the way we think about something or someone. Okay? The number you see on the graphs, coins D, helps us understand the magnitude of the difference or effect we observe. A smaller value indicates a lesser effect, while a larger value, of course, signifies a stronger effect. To determine whether this value is statistically significant, we have placed a symbol next to the figure. Okay, for example, a plus sign or an asterisk. As shown in this graph, there can also be negative values, meaning that the effect is reversed. That is, greater exposure, for example, to hate is associated or cause a decrease in the identified outcome. Okay, as I mentioned before, when this negative value is statistically significant, the bar is blue. Conversely, if the positive value is statistically significant, the bar is red. Additionally, the number of studies included in each meta-analysis appears entre parentheses. Okay, let's start with the development of explicit negative attitude toward minorities. This is the first outcome where we found a statistically significant result. Experimental studies, which, as I mentioned before, allow us to establish causal relationships, show us a moderate and significant effect. This implies that exposure to hate increases explicit negative attitude toward minority groups. Similarly, exposure to hate can encourage the development of negative stereotypes about these groups and reduce positive attitudes toward them. This is already an impressive result. Exposure to hate changes the way we think about minorities. The remaining variables are not significant. However, in my opinion, this is still an interesting finding, particularly regarding the cognitive reaction produced by hate content. Experimental research shows that hate content fails to generate a significant change in how people support or endorse such content. We will talk later about the importance of this finding. Here we can explore how exposure to hate influences relationships and interactions between different social groups. When we talk about groups dynamics, we refer to how groups interact with each other, how they perceive one another, and the level of trust they share. We have only two variables here, and among them, exposure to hate affects trust between different groups. For example, between a majority and a minority. This means that following exposure to hate speech, the mutual trust between this group tend to decrease. Okay, this is a crucial point because trust is the foundation of healthy and respectful relationships between different social groups. In this slide, we will explore how exposure to hate in the media can influence behaviors, both in the cyberspace and in real life. In this section, we found 4 outcomes that show significant results, represented by, of course, the red bars. In this case, these meta-analyses are mainly based on correlational studies. Okay, remember, this means that isn't a causal relationship, like in experimental studies, only an association. So we know these phenomena are related, but we cannot say that one causes the other. In this case, the strongest association with hate exposure is only victimization. This means that higher exposure is linked to a greater chance of becoming a target of these attacks, which of course makes sense. Similarly, we found a moderate and slightly significant relationship between exposure to hate and participation in online hate speech. This suggests that exposure is linked not only to victimization, but also to actively spreading hate on the web. Regarding offline behavior, exposure to hate is also connected with aggressive actions in real life, showing a moderate and significant effect. Another interesting result, individuals exposed to hate content don't show a willingness to openly contradict such discourse. It's important. In the graph, this is reflected as a resistance to hate speech, meaning that the result is not statistically significant. Once again, we observe that the content itself doesn't generate a reaction, in this case, a behavior reaction. This finding is closely related to research on bystanders, who may or may not intervene in contexts where hate speech is spread. For example, bystanders who are frequently exposed to this type of content tend to become less sensitive and, as a result, intervene less in these situations. This highlights the importance of the result of this meta-analysis. So until now, we have focused on how individuals respond to exposure. Now let's look at the relationship between the comments themselves. We analyze two key variables: the contagiousness of hate comment, this refers to how one hate comment can trigger another, and the association between online hate comments and hate crimes. In the first case, online hate comments tend to spark more hate speech, creating a contagious effect. However, when trying to link these comments with hate crimes in specific geographic areas, no significant relationships was found. In conclusion, although online hate can be contagious and spread quickly, it doesn't necessarily lead to more serious actions like hate crimes. Now, this is my last slide in this moment. What happens to our emotion and psychological well-being? This is a crucial aspect, especially when considering mental health. The more important consequence of this exposition is depression. Experimental studies, which allow us to establish causal relationships, show a significant and substantial impact on the development of depressive symptoms following exposure to hate. This finding is confirmed by correlational studies. In other words, there is a clear link between exposure to hateful messages and feelings of depression. On the other hand, we see that exposure to hate can also reduce overall life satisfaction and increase the fear of potential terrorist attack. While these effects are weaker compared to depressive symptoms, they remain important factors to consider when we are talking about mental health. Finally, regarding negative emotional reaction toward specific groups or the development of anxiety in social interactions, studies have not found significant effects. This could suggest that while exposure to hate impacts mental health, it doesn't necessarily lead to negative emotions toward a specific group or increased anxiety in social interaction. Moreover, we note again that hateful content itself doesn't provoke strong negative emotions such as aversion, nor does it contribute to development of anxiety concerning the content itself. This has been analyzed in both experimental and correlational studies. Similar to attitude and behavior changes, it appears that hate content alone doesn't succeed in triggering significant emotional reactions. Okay. In summary, This analysis shows that exposure to hate not only affects opinions and behaviors, but also has a profound impact on emotion and consequently in mental health. So it's your turn, Ghayda.
Thank you so much, Pablo, and thank you for the I think even the non-scientific, strong meta-analytic brains in us clearly see the relations with the colors and with the size of the bars. So I think that this is, from the many systematic reviews that we've done at CPN-PREV, I can clearly say that this is one of the most powerful ones because of the depth and breadth of the significant results that are, and if we try to summarize it in a nutshell, I think our systematic review and the meta-analysis clearly shows us that exposure to hate speech is not harmless. Our studies show that exposure to hate speech has negative, significant effects on mental health. I think Pablo presented us clearly how it impacts depressive symptoms, lowered satisfaction with life, and these are two, I would say, key risk factors for mental health problems, but even for violent acting out. Actually, in other studies, we see that having a negative outlook at the future and being less satisfied with one's life is a risk factor for violent behavior. But it also affects the perpetration of hate online by making it more contagious and by cutting the bridge between the online perpetration and the offline perpetration. So while there is no significant connection with hate crimes, because it's often much more complicated to measure hate crimes and they're not always reported, there is an association to aggressive behavior that may be criminal in a way. And most importantly, there is a negative impact on inter-community relations through the augmentation of negative stereotypes toward minorities, the decreasing of positive attitudes, but also two other factors that are, for me, very preoccupying in terms of the divisiveness, of the risk for divisiveness to society, which are social fear and reduced intergroup trust. It's very difficult to be united to one's community members if we are afraid of them, if we don't trust them. This is really how the us versus them rhetorics develop and how the conflict, the inter-community conflicts can develop, and how these fears can be used and instrumentalized by influencing powers or politicians or other personalities to really fester divisiveness in society. So hate speech really has a significant impact, has to be taken seriously. But the issue is, the question and the main question is, what can we do about it? Is countering an approach? And I think what Pablo was referring to us in the fact that, he referred that these are important results to take into consideration, the fact that people who are exposed to hate speech, at least in those studies, do not seem to react to that content. Neither do they reject the content or, counter it in the sense that there is some kind of passiveness, quote unquote, and Pablo, you referred to the bystander effect, that passiveness toward the hate speech or the normalization of the hate speech that we're seeing. And this poses like a significant challenges for prevention. So we are here really together to think about what we can do about it. And this is exactly one of the reasons why we have Dr. Saltman on board. But it's also another reason why we will be launching soon our Delphi process, so we can assemble a host of international experts to be able to look at the results of these meta-analyses and other research that exists in the field and generate practices and recommendations for prevention. So just some food for thought in the next slide, and that is the last slide as well of our presentation, is really some of the ideas in terms of implication for practice. This is far from being exhaustive. This might feed the beginning of the Delphi process, but these recommendations for practice and they're not recommendations, really, they're ideas. They will be confronted to the expertise in the field through the Delphi process. But there obviously has to be some encouragement of change in consumer behavior. Uh, is it through digital well-being programs in terms of primary prevention, for example? So can we teach consumers how to protect their digital safety, their digital or their, internet, social media well-being practices, how to, online ethics, privacy, cybersecurity practices? Should we encourage consumers to use tools that block, mute hate speech, or go to servers that, provide them more control over what they see online, or platforms that they consider being more responsible toward their safety as users? Should we promote digital literacy and critical thinking? Um, are there any programs that document the efficiency of these interventions and prevention initiatives, for example? And given the massive impact on, I mean, massive, given the psychological impacts of exposure to online hate, should we invest in emotional teaching, emotional regulation when facing online hate? How can we build support networks and personal resiliency to hate? Because oftentimes when we are exposed to hate, we're a bit alone, right? Like we're not exposed to it next to somebody who can support us immediately, and sometimes we are overexposed to it. Should we strengthen content moderation and reporting mechanisms? Should hateful content online be regulated? Should we regulate hateful anonymity online? So if you post hate, we should know who you are. Should governments hold platforms more and more accountable? And regulate, in what ways they should regulate? And how can we, for example, amplify voices of positive influencers, people who are very known, who have millions of listeners? How can we amplify those pro-social or those positive spaces? So these are just some ideas, some food for thought to start the discussion, and to say that based on our meta-analysis and systematic review, I go out of this with the message that something has to be done. Now, the question is, what can we all do together to address the impacts of online hate on ourselves as people, the people we care for, and us as professionals as well? Thank you so much. And with that, I will pass it back to Sébastien, who I guess will pass it to Erin.
Exactly. I have not much to add except to give the floor to Dr. Erin Saltman. We are very lucky to have her with us. So without further ado, let's go.
Noah, I mean, firstly, thanks so much, because I get to do the easiest part of this presentation, which is I got to give myself the time to entirely read every single page of your recently launched report and opine about it and think about it and see how we can do more. Like, honestly, you guys did so much work. Like, really, as a methodology nerd, hats off to you and your team. It's extremely impressive. The objective always sounds so simple with a project like this. The objective to review and synthesize evidence on how media exposure to hate affects or is associated with various outcomes seems easy to us. We assume hate, bad, you give me hate speech, it will have a negative impact. But just seeing how you had to synthesize down over 15,000 publications down to 55 studies that really fit a criteria to show impact that you were looking for just shows how little we have some of those proofs, but that you were willing to bring forward the data in a conversation about something as broad as hate exposure and its impacts. And I think that, why is the data important? Well, so if you don't know the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, we are a little bit of a cyborg NGO in that we were founded by tech companies for tech companies to work on preventing the exploitation of digital platforms by terrorists and violent extremists. And we're so lucky to have Ghayda as the chair of our independent advisory committee, which is a rowdy bunch of government and human rights and experts and practitioners, and they don't always agree and we don't always agree, but it is so necessary to have that multi-stakeholder feedback loop, because we can assume a lot and data can be cut in different ways to try to prove different things. And after working for many years with tech companies, policies really are a data-driven approach. When a tech company approaches policy, there has to be a line where that policy has to be definable, defendable, and scalable. And feeling icky or awkward or even offended is not a policy line. It's subjective. And in the world, and especially online, you have the right to offend and be offended. In fact, the internet was pretty much founded on that basic principle. And defining at what point something is no longer all right, what point something is illegal or harmful, really does take a data-driven approach, because that policy has to be definable, defendable, and scalable. I really also appreciated that this report did not just cover English language, but also touched on French, Arabic, Spanish, and Russian to give us a little bit more of a global perspective. I'd love to dig into that data more. But when we're working with tech companies, and we have over 30 tech companies now, I'll throw in a link if you want to just see a logo page. It's not the entire interweb. I am not the internet, but we do work with a lot of companies, large and small. And some of them are the biggest of the big, the Microsofts, the Googles, the Metas, who will have more resources, even if sometimes those ebb and flow. They will have more engineering support. We will usually hold those companies to a higher account. But we're also working with lots of smaller platforms, some that are run by just one or two people that aren't monetized very well, or really don't have a lot of language support and are relying on tools for any sort of global scale. And it is an interplay. None of us are just on one platform. So when companies are looking at how to prioritize policy development, even for us looking at just terrorism and violent extremism, hate speech is something that we would call borderline or adjacent to terrorism and violent extremism. I'm going to throw more links at you guys. We're all former or current academics. We love bedtime reading. But hate is one of those areas that we also know and have data around. And this data also proved it feeds into violence. It feeds into violent extremism, whether that is rhetorical violence or physical real-world violence. We also know that every genocide, many predating the internet, starts with a combination of dehumanization, hate speech towards a group, and misinformation about that group. And so it's very important to remember. And I also really appreciated off the back of that we also brought traditional media into scope, not to make us dissuade away from the ills with social media that we want to discuss. But it was really important because it is often the case when I'm working with a new tech company and we're pushing for further robust policies, that they will look to other things and say, well, is that allowed in a library? Is that allowed on mainstream media? Because if it is, why can we justify censoring it online in a decentralized access space? And so the more we can point to, well, actually, this is not allowed in other spaces, it really helps me guide tech companies to take more robust policies. And when I was reading this, it did bring up for me examples of mainstream media. And I saw very few of the studies that you were even able to pull from and synthesize covered mainstream media. But some key examples that stood out for me. One was when the Norway Anders Breivik attacks first happened. Before newspapers knew the identity of the attacker, everyone said Norway's 9/11, terrorist attack in Norway. And as soon as the identity of the attacker was known, most of those headlines changed to lone gunman, and the T word was not used. I did a study about this at the time. That is important because in a post-9/11 framework, capital T terrorism was only being used, and in many cases is still mainly used for Islamist groups. And it doesn't dawn on us that a white male could be a terrorist, and we use different language and sometimes exotified language like lone wolf, which is not always helpful. This is also the case when we look at saying something can't be on social media, but then we look at groups that are violent extremist groups sharing links out to mainstream media, and even examples of mainstream media sharing full links out to hate-based or terrorist-related content. I remember Fox News shared a link to the entire Jordanian pilot burning video without edit. And even more recently, if we say, well, we've grown since then. Most recently, local news in the area published the Antioch High School Shooters Manifesto in full from the recent school shooting in Tennessee. So this is an ongoing issue that we need to bring mainstream media into scope when we talk about social media, because they have to kind of work in unity. And I guess I would love to throw some questions back at Ghayda and Pablo as we go. And one is just if anything else stood out to you of that difference between when you could find a study that dealt with mainstream media, anything that stood out with you as a lesson learned that we should be passing on to social media, or that we should make sure mainstreams even in traditional media a little bit more.
Thank you so much, Erin. That was really brilliant. And do feel free to jump in anytime talking about what you have brought into the online space in terms of your expertise in regulating content. Pablo, I saw you unmuted your microphone, so maybe you wanted to answer that about traditional media. But just before I couldn't agree more, Erin, that a lot of I mean, many historian colleagues talk about that as well. We know that many genocides, including the Holocaust, including the Rwanda genocide, was like this was radio, like traditional media, online environments didn't exist before. So the issue of hate and dehumanization is really quite, and misinformation. Just this combination of those three words that you combined were so excellent to speak about genocides or hateful or violence is something that has existed a long time ago. I know that in traditional media, there are certain associations of traditional media that have released reports and guides on responsible coverage of incidents and also on responsible and ethical reporting. So these kinds of professional practices do exist, and I know that they do exist in the online space. And like, you're more than welcome to share with us about these guidelines. But I'll hand it to Pablo, because I know you may want to say something.
Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, we didn't see any change between traditional media and social media. Actually, most of the traditional media were online newspaper, for example. So again, it's the online space is again very important. But of course, it's important what you said about the companies and the role of companies in this thing, in this problem. Only to express maybe the importance of social media in some countries. For example, in Africa, not all people have access to internet. So and Meta, for example, provide access to Facebook. So the only thing, the only platform, the only internet that people know is Facebook. So the only way to have some information and news from the world, from, I don't know, their country is Facebook, for example. So it's incredibly important, the role of companies in counter this kind of discourse. So maybe the question is also for you, what do you think is the role of companies in this problem?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for letting me throw questions back at you as I go. It's more fun for me if it's a dialogue, getting to dig into your research as well. How a paper like this really relates to our work, and again, we'll just continue thanking you for it. There will be a divide that is going to continue to form, that there are companies that are willing to come to the table, even if they're, easy to criticize, and we should keep criticizing. There are still those that are at least willing to be parts of dialogue, even if those dialogues aren't easy. And then there are types of companies, sometimes they're smaller and obscure, so they're harder to reach. Sometimes they are just blatantly founded on a principle of sometimes negligence, or sometimes just pure free speech without other considerations of rights, that are unwilling to come to the table. And so there's a real limitation that we can work with those willing to come to the table. And even some of the member companies that we have that, public facing, are are looking to backslide or have criticism against them behind the scenes when it comes to things like incident response or a crisis moment. They have employees that are not the wealthy ones owning the companies, that are the trust and safety bodies that are still trying really hard to work on these issues. The ones maybe even mentioned in your report that are being exposed to lots of negative and harmful content to try to take that burden on and do something about it behind the scenes. We have found that we can progress policies when it is data driven. An example that I will give of one from my time when I was even working at Meta was on something like Holocaust denial, which is illegal in some countries. It is not illegal in most countries, but there are about 8 countries that literally make it illegal, in which case it has to be removed, but many others do not. And we had to show in data to the policy team that was going to change the policy that, in fact, John Stuart Mill's might be wrong. And this is really hard. We all go to a nice university, maybe. We learn about the marketplace of ideas, and that kind of sticks with us that, hey, censorship isn't the way to change. Why should we justify removing an idea if it's a bad idea? The marketplace will surface something to the top. And we were able to, over time, show that actually the data for something like Holocaust denial, we weren't seeing that exposure to Holocaust denial led other people to jump in and say, actually, that's wrong. Here's some real facts you should consider. Those groups were shut down very quickly. We found out that actually it was a very small group of very dedicated and often white supremacy linked individuals that were purveying a lot of the narrative. And we could show with the data that, in fact, we didn't see the marketplace of ideas kicking into action because there was fear about standing up against some of these ideas and an echo chamber that would form around them and cause harm. And it took that to change a policy around Holocaust denial being equivocated with anti-Semitism and hate speech. And there's many examples of that, especially when something doesn't look like blatant hate speech, because we're like, well, we're just saying maybe it's not real. And so it was helpful for you guys as well to put forward definitions for hate speech. And it's something I reflected on that we've had to do with terrorism and violent extremism. So, for example, one of our pet projects a couple years ago was to launch a definitions and principles site. And maybe this is something we could work on, is add a little bit more on hate speech frameworks to this and where there are legal frameworks on hate speech that feed into this. Because there's an interactive map in here that we made to make it fun so that you could look on how countries are defining terrorism and violent extremism so that companies could take from that language and those frameworks and build their own policies to make them realize you're not starting from scratch. There's a lot of language around this. Your work on hate speech showed there's a lot of parameters. There's a lot of UN guiding principles and frameworks. You don't have to start at 0. You're starting at 7 or 8 or 9 out of 10 with understanding language you can use for policy. It's also really important that that data feedback loop with researchers are here. So I will also say, if others are on the line and they want to contribute, we do fund an academic network called the Global Network on Extremism and Technology. There's a lot of little creepy bedtime reading insights here for everyone to dive into if you want. But it is funded for academics around the world to write about any of the trends they're seeing on extremism and technology. And it's important because it feeds to us as well when a new trend is popping up, what hate and incitement can look like. And Ghayda will know, she joined us in Singapore not long ago, or feels like not long ago, maybe it was a little while ago now. But working with researchers there, they were just pointing at things like hate speech, saying, something as easy in passing as, well, I hope you're considering all the memes about cauliflowers right now. And I said, no, vegetation is not my field of expertise. And they said, well, actually, in Asia, in a lot of the Islamophobic rhetoric, they are using the term cauliflower culling or cauliflower farming to talk about killing Muslims, because there was apparently a massacre that took place on a farm that had been growing cauliflowers. So that is actually coded language for targeting Muslims. And I said, okay, now I've got to pay attention to cauliflowers and actually work with these academics on highlighting what coded hate speech might look like in a region and not in English, and what regions that might apply to. That's how we take some of research like what you're putting forward and say, okay, how does that really manifest in granular terms in the online space? Because there may be easier and English biased, perhaps, lists of what hate speech is. But this is a very ephemeral space, and it is one that uses the memification or even just what does visual hate look like. So even if I have a really good list of terms, when it becomes just visual or it's just an image or a video, how do I translate that understanding of what hate is so I can say that is not just funny, that is actually dehumanizing hate speech against a protected category of people. And I think that's going to be some of the next steps going from a paper like what you've produced is maybe working together to dig in and say, where can we really bring forward lists of hate terms that many have already started putting together and actually bring them into a master list that can be reviewed and added to. And I think that was one of the points that I said, I think this might be GIFCT homework going forward from this is to say, well, you had these studies you looked at, which ones actually provided frameworks for what they meant when they said hate speech? How do we bring that into a bigger database that tech companies can review so they see where the source is and they consider taking on some real practical ways that they can understand and program hate speech? And I wanted to talk a little bit about the implications for policy section that you guys put forward. It was the one section I was like, you gave me 20 pages on this and you gave me less than a page on policy. But I think this is where, again, my homework is being given to me. But you really did show that data implies that hate speech has the potential to trivialize and normalize prejudices, and in turn, can harm targeted communities. And you made that very clear. So in basic terms, there's a connection with showing exposure to hate, increasing the likelihood of online and offline violence. And severe symptomatic emotions. And with that, I think we need to support the importance of self-regulation and possibly some very baseline alternative ways that regulation can help guide tech companies. And I think you also pointed out the need for that accessibility to psychological support or mental health services. And this led to some thoughts I had, and I'd love you to come in after I'm done within the moment, but on programs to not just remove content when it is found. That is something we always push for if it's violating, if we can show that there's a violation spectrum there, but also how a multi-stakeholder community of experts can work together on things like positive interventions and safeguarding. And there was some interesting work that I know we'll have different ideas of tech companies, but I know of some interesting researchers that were working within Meta, and they were looking at strategic network disruptions. That is when, instead of doing a whack-a-mole approach for taking down individual pieces of content one at a time, you actually map a network, whether it's of a gang or a terrorist group or a violent extremist group, and you take the network down all at once. And it makes it a very hard hole. It makes it much harder to reform that network in an online space. However, when you look at the donut ring of individuals that didn't get taken down, but that were connected to that network, they are actually left with a spiritual void. They were not fully members, but they were attracted to the network. They were engaged, but they weren't members. And people found that if you study that network, they go passive. They kind of go limp. They don't have a same purpose or vigor. And that is the group that you can engage with counter narratives or alternative groups. That is actually a very vulnerable group that can either slide worse into hate and extremism or could be engaged with. And there was some early testing about engaging that group with alternative narratives and redirection towards other types of groups that showed some really interesting preliminary results. Raises a lot of questions too as well about what you direct people to. And that's why these programs, the usually really innovative ones, are really hard to scale, because ultimately it's not going to be Facebook or X saying, come be more Facebooky or come be more Xy. It'll be more like, here's a local group or a practitioner or a network in your community that has some real world connection that you could get involved with, or here's somebody that you could talk to, or here's psychological support. But that does have to be country specific, if not town specific almost, for that passive online moment to become an active engagement. And so I guess I wanted to also open it back up to you guys around some of your thoughts on using a redirect method. So if hate speech is removed, what can we, on top of just removing that speech, what can we provide the person that was exposed to it or that reshared and was engaged with it? Anything we should consider the do's and don'ts of how you might approach that, because we have some good methodology, and I'll share something that some of our working groups did before on positive interventions and mapping. But some of your thoughts on where you'd like to see that go, you know, what's kind of the prize at the end where it would be really innovative to develop something based on this research?
Thank you so much, Erin. This is great. And you've provided a lot of food for thought. And I think what you've shown is actually the speed at which this the dynamism, if I can say, of this phenomenon, the difficulty, the symbols that you talked about, the cauliflower example is so compelling, of course. And I think many people joining us today maybe didn't even know about it and have learned many things around it. So, and every single approach has had its limitations, right? So the list approach has had its limitations. The network approach has had its limitation. We're faced with capacity limitations, with resources limitations. I appreciate you referencing and differentiating between the people working hard inside versus, let's say, the upper leadership or the upper vision that can be different. There are people working and they're affected personally also by the material they are exposed to. And so we talk about well-being. We talk about positive solutions, as you mentioned. I think it's highly challenging because this is really an ever-evolving field. And it kind of, I just saw Stacy's comment in saying, prevention, to go towards prevention. Not that, of course, that regulation is not worthwhile, but then regulation is faced with a significant challenge that is connected to definitions, right? The problem also is the fact that researchers do not have that easy access to data that they can analyze, the data that you've referred to and the ability to analyze data. So we face a big problem, a complicated problem like this, chimère, this monster with so many different heads. And it likely needs to be, I don't think it has an Achilles heel. I think that it needs to be really, the response needs to be multi-pronged. And some of the solutions are the solutions you've offered as well. And I think I'm very much looking forward to our Delphi process because it will be that converger of those amazing brains and people who wrote about all this and thought about solutions. So we can think about, yes, innovative things, but also maybe things that we can backward in history and see what has worked. Sometimes simple things can work as well. I want to redirect it back to Sébastien and Pablo and see whether you had also anything to add. And I know that with Sébastien, Pablo, and you, Erin, we want to give space to the people who have given us the precious gift of their time today to engage in a conversation. So Sébastien, back to you.
Maybe actually I'll let Pablo have the final official words, and then we'll move on to the questions from the public. So here you go, Pablo, for final parting words.
Okay, thanks, Seb. I totally agree with Ghayda. We don't need to target one solution. We need to target probably a network of solutions. Unfortunately, I think we know very little about how we can intervene in the cyberspace. Very little. We really don't know. So redirect, for example, strategies, maybe it's great, but actually we don't know because this kind of strategy or project doesn't have an evaluation an evaluation, a real evaluation, not only how many people is engaging in the platform or how many people are redirected to another website, for example. Now, this kind of strategy works or doesn't work. That is the question, and we don't know about that. Maybe one clue is bystanders, actually. But we know, as I said before, bystanders are less sensitive when they are more exposed to hate. So it's really difficult. I think we need to explore different solutions. We need to experiment different solutions, but unfortunately, as I said, we know very little about how we can counter this. So thank you very much.
All right, so for the next steps, first of all, I want to thank the panelists for having such a great and also very interactive discussion. And now we're going to push the interaction further by involving the attendees. So I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you. And I will leave the floor to everybody. Know that you can now turn on your cam and mic to ask questions, or you can also give them via the chat. I have some that were already sent my way. So thanks a lot, and we will be stopping the recording.